Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's topic is Conservation Connect Bison, back from the brink with Dennis Jorgensen, Bison Program Manager at WWF-US. To begin today's webinar, WWF has provided me with a great video that sets up today's conversation.
Thing about out here, you definitely kind of got to know where you can and can't drive. And babies right here. This year, we definitely have our numbers up, and it shows. We're definitely getting a really good calf crop this year, and there's babies everywhere. It's a rewarding feeling seeing the babies roam with the relatives, that we're doing it for a greater purpose. As a Lakota people, they're our relatives. They're part of us. They're who we've actually evolved from. We were once one nation. We've come from the Buffalo Nation. The land in general, having our relatives home, is thriving.
Bison play a critical role in the prairies, having evolved with the prairies over thousands of years. When the bison come back, there's a lot of things that they do in terms of how they graze. They tend to graze on the hoof, which means moving as they graze, and so you get a patchy effect where some of the grass is short, some of the grass is tall, and that creates a variety of habitats for all of the different species that occupy the prairie.
Buffalo help the land regenerate our traditional plants. So it's not just helping us in the food system, it's helping Unchimaka too. It's helping heal her. Unchimaka is grandmother earth, and it's one of our duties to help her.
I'm really grateful and thankful to be able to be part of this program, and like I said earlier, we're doing it for the right reasons. We're doing it all for the same goal. We're bringing them back. We're making ecosystems better. We're getting that food sovereignty back, and to be able to partner up with all these great people in different programs, it's for the greater good, and it's all for the same goal.
Such a beautiful video. I will turn it back over to you, Dennis. There you go.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll just bring up the presentation here.
Yep.
And let's see here. Okay, there.
Perfect.
And let's see. Okay.
Awesome. So, Dennis, again, thank you so much for being here, chatting with me and everybody who's tuning in. It's going to be a great conversation. So, to begin, you've been with the World Wildlife Fund since 2007 and have a very rich background in environmental consulting and field biology. So, what sparked your initial interest in conservation, particularly in the Northern Great Plains?
Well, Brooke, first, thanks for having me, and I'm super excited to be here, and just grateful for the opportunity. Really briefly, before I introduce myself and answer your question, I just want to share that, during my talk, I'm going to talk about a lot of our work with Native nations in the Northern Great Plains. And clearly, I am not Indigenous, and I am an outsider. I was born in Canada, in Calgary, and those are also traditional homelands of Indigenous people, of course. But in my work, I've had the great honor and privilege of working with a number of Native nations in the Northern Great Plains, and I'm going to share some of what I've learned over those many years, but I'm not speaking for any Native nations. I'm speaking more from my experience in working with Native nations, learning from Native nations, and in this larger space of bringing bison back with Native nations. So to answer your question, I was one of those kids that was just fascinated by everything that was in my backyard, whether it be snakes, um, uh, uh, salamanders, tadpoles, frogs, bees, trees. If it was out in the park behind my house, I was exploring it, and that stuck with me my entire life. And um, to this day, of course, but I would say that when I was starting my studies in university, I already knew that I wanted to be a biologist and conservationist. I think that actually before I even knew what a conservationist was in elementary school, I was saying I wanted to be one. Um, and so when it came time to do my master's, I had actually been working in environmental consulting for a few years and had worked on a project where I was trying to ensure that rattlesnakes were not harmed during an oil and gas pipeline project and that no one was bitten during that project. And that sparked my curiosity. So I ended up doing my master's tracking rattlesnake migrations in southeastern Alberta, which is the northern extent of the prairie rattlesnakes range. And that introduced me to the prairies, and my time in environmental consulting did the same. And so I was really fascinated by prairies. And as I was wrapping up my master's, a job became available with World Wildlife Fund's Northern Great Plains program based in Montana. I applied and I got my dream job, and I've been at this for 17 years and I love it. And over the years, I think we've kind of shaped our program with our Native Nation partners and in the interests of what they want to achieve, what their vision is for the region. And so that kind of brings me to where I am now.
It was just in your heart and soul from the beginning. How awesome. So, most of us have an understanding of what happened to North America's bison herds, but we might not understand the full picture. Can you share the history of bison in North America?
For sure. Well, so I'm not a historian, but I will share what I've learned over the years. Um, I guess I would start by saying that at one time, prior to European settlement, they estimate that there were between 30 and 60 million bison in North America, and that they were one of the most widespread mammals on the continent. And as a result, essentially, they were fundamental to the lifeways of the Indigenous people of the plains and really of a significant portion of North America. And that meant that they were central to their culture, their spirituality, their economy, their way of life. And when European settlement started, it was clear that if Native people had access to this abundant resource, that they were going to be very difficult to conquer. And just for a perspective on what it meant to have buffalo, there's actually archaeological research that shows that Native people of the plains were among the tallest people in the world prior to European settlement. So they had a lifeway and an economy and um, a, a way of life that thrived with the buffalo. But with the arrival of European settlers, of course, with the expansion westward, and including and maybe in particular with the expansion of the railroad, there's some amazing examples, and when I say amazing, I also mean tragic, in the sense that in Montana, the Northern Pacific Railroad arrived in 1881, and by 1884 they were shipping out the last hides of any buffalo in Montana eastward to tanneries. And, there was also an economy that was underpinning killing buffalo. So buffalo hides, buffalo leather is one of the thickest, toughest leathers that you can find. And during the Industrial Revolution, they found that when they tanned these buffalo hides, they made the best belts for machinery that was fueling the Industrial Revolution. And so that was, basically the funding for killing all these buffalo, but it was a wasteful endeavor. Often they would kill the buffalo and they would take the hide and they would leave the rest, and it would just rot. And then in kind of later times, people actually came back and collected the bones that were across the plains. And I'll show a picture a little bit later of a mountain of skulls, and probably many people have seen that. It's quite an iconic image. But the bones were then collected to refine sugar, to make bone china, and fertilizers as well. So essentially, bison were reduced from between 30 and 60 million animals down to just 1,000 animals by 1886. There was a book published called The Extermination of the Bison, published by William Temple Hornaday, who was with the New York Zoological Society. And basically, he had tried to survey the anyone who knew of remaining bison across the continent, and he even came out to look for some of the last bison to taxidermy them for the New York Zoological Society for display. And he had a very difficult time finding any bison in 1886. He did find 30 in north central Montana, and he ended up collecting 18 of those. Now, ironically, he was also the person who sounded the alarm on the fact that bison might disappear completely. He helped to start the American Bison Society in 1905, which was included Theodore Roosevelt and a number of other prominent people. And they then were part of the restoration of bison from the remaining 1,000 that there were on the continent up to approximately 20,000 bison in 1935. And what we see now is that although there were also some ranchers and indigenous people who helped to bring back some pockets of bison across the continent, since 1935, to some degree, the number of bison managed as wildlife in conservation, in tribal herds, and so on, has stagnated to some degree. So really, we're on the brink of a whole new movement of bringing bison back.
And to go down this thought train a little further, why was the eradication of bison such a catastrophe, both culturally and ecologically?
So our Indigenous partners talk about living with bison since time immemorial. So for thousands of years, bison were central to their culture, their spiritual practices, and I'll use the term lifeways, and essentially that in some degree refers to a way of life, their way of life. And so, when you look at a bison, today some of my friends and colleagues in the Native Nation communities refer to bison as having been their Walmart, so to speak. And what they mean by that is when you look at a bison, their bladder was a water bladder for storing water. Their hides were their clothing and were their teepees. Their hides were their robes in the depths of winter. Their bones were their tools. Their horns were their cups and their spoons. And, there really wasn't a part of the buffalo that wasn't used that would have been seen as wasteful. And so, they were really central not only to their material culture, but also their spiritual practices and their ceremonies and everything. And you realize that when you see that even though bison, from the time that they were nearly eradicated to the time when many Native nations are bringing buffalo back, there was over 100 years, and yet bison still figure centrally in their spirituality and in their ceremonies. And now, we all have the big job of supporting tribes in their visions of bringing buffalo back in all the ways that they imagine, and that bison can play a role in their contemporary lives. And there's still many ways that they can. And ecologically, similarly, bison were the dominant grazer of the plains for thousands of years. And so all of the species that occupy the plains today evolved with bison. And that means that, bison would create the patchy grazing that I talked about in the video to create habitat for a variety of different species. Their hooves would aerate the soil. You can imagine that they moved in herds of hundreds and thousands of animals, and that they were churning up the soil, creating disturbance, and a lot of plant species like disturbance for their seeds establishing themselves and so on. I think also maybe a great illustration, you could imagine if a herd of hundreds or thousands of bison was moving through deep snow across the prairie. Not all prairie species are equipped for moving in deep snow. Pronghorn antelope being one example. They have very high foot loading, which means that essentially they kind of walk up on their toes because they're such fast animals. They're the second fastest land mammal in the world. And so they would just punch through deep snow and basically not be able to move through it. But bison created these highways, and they're foraging as well. You can see their massive hump. Basically, they sweep their heads back and forth through the snow to get down to the vegetation underneath. And that would allow for deer and elk and a number of other animals that are browsers and grazers to get to the food that they needed as well. So when you take bison out of the equation, you're completely changing the system and affecting all the species that are reliant on bison.
Yeah, so this was a really big deal when we lost these, keystone species, these ecosystem engineers. So let's shift a little bit to today. You work really closely with some Native nations to restore bison on tribal lands. Who are these tribes and where are they located? And what does the bison mean to them since you work so closely with them?
Well, I guess first of all, if I could, to answer that question, I'd love to introduce Lois Red Elk, who is a Dakota woman, a descendant of Sitting Bull, who lives on the Fort Peck Reservation. And I'd say that she really changed the way that I work, and I think that WWF works in this space. She and a group of community members at Fort Peck were working on issues of public health, and they were working with researchers at Montana State University. And she, in that space of working on her community's health, asked the researchers the question, how do we ensure that the return of buffalo contributes to the health and well-being of our people in the ways that prophecy foretold? And by asking that question, it really changed the way that I was thinking about the work. And I think I was working very much in a what I'll call traditional conservation approach, in that, I think sometimes a conservation organization might bring an agenda. And in that case, we were kind of saying, how can we help you with range management planning, which is a very narrow focus. It's about how do you ensure that bison grazing impacts grasses in the ways that you would hope. And really, it zoomed out and it said, hey, bringing buffalo back in a way that is meaningful, that is lasting with the people of this place is critical, because if you aren't bringing the bison back in the ways that impact the people that who will manage and sustain them into the future and for generations, then you're not really impacting conservation in the ways that you really could in terms of the potential that it has if you bring them back with Indigenous communities. And so that started an effort to understand the vision of the community groups that had been established. And at that point, that community group actually renamed themselves. They renamed themselves the Pate group. And in the Dakota and Nakota and Lakota language, Pate means female buffalo. And I'm not sure if your listeners would know, but buffalo are matriarchal. So there is a cow herd, which is led by a matriarch, and she's the one that guides the movements of the herd. The bulls are really peripheral. They are either are in bachelor herds or there are lone bulls, and they really come around at the times when there's mating opportunity and so on. But otherwise, they're separate from the herd. And so the Pate group was an acknowledgement of the fact that women in the community were leading the charge on thinking about the ways in which they wanted to see buffalo come back for the benefit of the people, the land, and the buffalo themselves. And it was referenced earlier by TJ Heiner in the video, but essentially the creation stories of the Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota people involve the buffalo emerging from the earth with the people, and that at one time they were one and the same. And so, they reference and speak of buffalo as their relatives, and they want to treat them as their relatives. Now, that being said, they do consume the buffalo, but in their creation story, it also talks about the buffalo offering their lives to sustain the people. And so there's this close relationship. And really in the work that WWF does today, as I said, I would acknowledge how important Lois's question was and how important working with the Pate group has been in shaping the way we work, because it ultimately means that it is the vision of the communities and the Native nations that we work with that is shaping what we work to achieve together. And that's made all the difference. And it continues to make a difference because what we try to do is to connect our Native Nation partners with a network of partners, whether it be funders or technical experts or otherwise, who can help them achieve their vision.
Yeah, just incredible. And continuing down this same thought process here, using the Lakota bison herd on the Rosebud Indian as reservation as an example, how did WWF support the Sicangu Lakota people? I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did. That was
Oh,
perfect.
good.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. So, that was a really interesting opportunity. And, it's interesting because we've worked in this space long enough that we might be working on another project or another species, and someone hears about, that we happen to be visiting a certain reservation. And in this case, my colleagues, Christy Bly and Monica Rattlinghawk, were at Rosebud Reservation, and they were approached by the CEO of the Rosebud Economic Development Corporation, which is the economic arm of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And they are now called Sicangu Co, and that's in acknowledgement of that they are the Sicangu Lakota people. And he said, his name is Weezypun Little Elk, and he said there was an opportunity to secure a 27,680 acre lease on their reservation where they would really like to restore buffalo. And they have a food sovereignty initiative. They have a Lakota immersion school that teaches their children the Lakota language, as well as teaching them to be whole Lakota people with knowing their language and their culture and so on. And so bringing back the buffalo was a natural next step for Sicangu Co. And we were super excited to be invited to explore this opportunity with them. We began looking at, first of all, the land base and our understanding of how many animals, how many buffalo that land could support, what the costs would be of doing that, how much revenue it could potentially generate for Sicangu Co. as they look at how many buffalo from the surplus each year they would use to feed their people, and then maybe have like a a market component to it where there's some sales of buffalo as well to outside entities. And so, essentially we did kind of a rapid feasibility assessment. We said, you know what, this looks like an amazing opportunity. We went to our partners and supporters and we said, we need this much money to help secure the lease for the first year. And we've assessed the opportunity and we want to develop a conservation and business plan with Sichangu Co. to look at what is it going to cost to build a herd. And in this particular case, we knew that the land could sustain up to 1,500 bison, which is huge. It's a very productive and thriving prairie site. It's at the northern extent of the Nebraska Sandhills, but it's in South Dakota at the northern tip. But yeah, extremely productive site. And so in short order, we had raised the money for the first year's lease payment. We began working with Sichangu Co. on the larger plan of what it was going to cost over 5 years. Together, we estimated that it would cost about $5 million and take about 5 years to establish everything, the infrastructure, new fencing for buffalo, to secure the buffalo. And we were fairly certain that the federal government might be able to provide surplus buffalo from parks, national parks, and national wildlife refuges. So we made some inquiries in that regard as well. And, I guess I could say I'm really excited to report that we thought it would take 5 years to raise $5 million and to build the site and to grow the herd. And we are now about 4 years down the road, and there are now over 1,000 bison at Lakota. And in just 3 years, about $6 million was raised for the project. And, things are going great. They have traditional harvests to feed community members. There's an amazing herd. And the grasslands are thriving, and I can speak to that as well. But I think there'll be more opportunity to do that. We've been supporting ecological monitoring there as well, and have seen some really amazing results.
Oh, wow. Just congratulations. Like, that
Thanks.
deserves a pat on the back itself. Like, that is a huge accomplishment. So you brought up a little piece there that I would like to go down a little bit further. So where did this particular herd come from, and why were these individuals chosen?
I would say that it is not necessarily so much a choice of which buffalo would be there. So having reached out to the Department of Interior to inquire about whether they might be able to receive some surplus bison from national parks and national wildlife refuges, essentially what happens at Department of Interior is that each year they survey all of the herds under Department of Interior, and they look at which sites are going to be doing roundups. I guess I'd like to address maybe just really briefly, when I say surplus bison, I guess if you think about any situation where there are bison currently, there are very few sites where bison are wild and free roaming. Generally today, bison are managed behind fences. There are maybe a few instances in northern Canada and Alaska where you might have what I would call free roaming or semi-free roaming herds, where generally they're free to move and they may encounter fences and so on. But really it's more like when they reach certain jurisdictions, they may be pushed back, or, there may be some management that happens. But in the lower 48, what you see is that bison have generally been restored behind fences. And that's kind of a legacy of the end of the open range days. So as cattle were replacing bison when bison were at their lowest numbers, at a certain point, based on property ownership, parcels were fenced in. And that meant that as bison were restored, generally they started to fall into that model of being fenced in. Now, when you think about a national park or something like that, it might not be the case that there is a fence around, for example, Yellowstone, but they will run into fences of adjacent landowners. Um, Now, what that means is that bison thrive. When you put bison on the landscape, they are like the ultimate survivors. They're so adapted to all of the conditions, whether it be heat or cold across North America, and so many different types of environments. But just to give you an example of how hardy a bison is and how remarkable they are, a number of years ago now, there was a storm in South Dakota, and that storm killed somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 cows. Now, South Dakota, even though there are far more cows than there are bison, South Dakota has more bison ranches than any other state in the country. The total number of bison that died in that same storm was 40. And that was only because they were fenced in, they were penned in an area, and they weren't able to move through the storm in the way that they typically would in nature. Um, so when I say surplus bison, essentially what I mean is that the national parks and the national wildlife refuges have a certain amount of land where they can restore bison. And bison populations, as a rule of thumb, will double about every 4 years. And so you ultimately need to have a mechanism for reducing the number of bison in a herd, whether that be, for Indigenous people consuming the bison or sharing the bison with other tribes, or for the national parks and the national wildlife refuges. They've also developed a program of sharing their surplus buffalo with tribes. There used to be more cases where either they would harvest them and then just send the meat to tribes, or they would actually have auctions like Custer State Park. But today, many of these parks and refuges are now routing their surplus bison to tribes. So I guess I would say that bison are not free to roam in the lower 48 like they once were. And there's very few instances of animals that are semi-free roaming in the lower 48. But it is something that I think in time and with the right partners, I think that there could be discussions of how bison can move across multiple jurisdictions, whether that be tribal and parks or other public lands or something like that.
At Custer State Park, that is a really cool spot, by the way, for anyone who hasn't gone, or Wind Cave as well in that area.
Yeah,
So I want to just pause for a second to just ask you one of our viewer questions really fast.
sure.
So it's right on par with what you're talking about right now, and that is the survivability of bison. So how do they survive? Do they grow a winter coat, which they then shed? Is that their main mechanism for getting through the harsh winters?
Yeah, they do have an amazing coat. And actually, one thing that I've learned, and I think I've learned a lot of little tidbits of trivia, but bison wool is actually warmer than sheep's wool. And they do shed the hair. And actually, you wouldn't see it in this picture, but just imagine that, some of these taller plants that in the spring and summer, you will find tufts of hair and sometimes almost entire sheets of their wool on the plains. And it's amazing because there's an opportunity both for people to gather that and to make use of it, but also grassland birds will collect that wool as well, and they will line their nests with it. And they've actually shown that the nests and the chicks in nests that use bison wool have a greater survivorship than those that do not. So yes, it has to do with their coats. And I guess I would also say that one thing that's really amazing about bison is that because they are such a large animal in the heat of summer, and think about that bison live all the way from Alaska to Mexico, that in some of those warmer climates, during the day they will absorb all that heat And then during the night, they will just radiate that back out again. And they may only go to water, once or twice a day, despite that heat. So they really are so well suited to all of these climate extremes. And the one thing that another researcher who's a friend of mine, Jeff Martin at South Dakota State University, has investigated is that it looks as though across that entire climate gradient across North America, that what you're getting is a change in grasses, and that they are lower in protein than they once were, as you get that kind of warming climate. And so he is also has identified that there will likely be a trend of bison getting smaller over time based on differences that he saw across herds, that he looked at across North America.
Yeah, well, that's great information. Thank you for that. And I'm getting a lot of questions that actually fall into the next one that I was going to ask you. So how perfect.
Sure.
So my next question was like, what is the long-term goal for this herd and how will it be managed? And then also, as you're answering that, could you also speak on the purebredness? Are these purebred bison, or are these mixed? Because it seems that a lot of people are aware that
Sure.
there's very, very few purebred bison left. So could you speak about all of that?
For sure. I think just really briefly, I'll speak to the Lakota goal, and if I need a reminder, you can remind me, Brooke. But of the second part of the question, but I think I can hold both. So for Lakota, I guess I would say that ultimately, what many of the communities and Native nations that we're working with are trying to achieve, even though it varies among each, whether what their sort of principal goals are. But I would say for the most part, what I've seen is that tribes are working towards a situation where they can feed their people, where they can generate sufficient revenue to at least pay for the associated costs, if not generate a profit, which is very possible. In the larger bison kind of market, there is a shortfall in supply. But that said, I think the main priority of the majority of the groups that we work with is feeding their people. And then also ensuring that the bison are healthy, that the land is healthy, and then that there is the opportunity to access the places and that where the buffalo are, and to access the buffalo themselves, to commune with the buffalo and spend time on the land. One thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that even within a reservation, and in some cases in the Northern Great Plains region, there are massive reservations on the order of 1 million or even more than 2 million acres in some cases, that there's very limited access of many Native people to their own lands, because those lands get leased to ranchers. And the statistics for the Northern Great Plains is that it's nearly half of the lands that are leased to non-tribal ranchers, and the other half are leased to tribal ranchers. But once someone is leasing that land, generally an average tribal member may not have access to those lands to gather traditional foods, medicines, or just to spend time on the land. And so when we're helping to create these places to bring buffalo back, our hope and what we're seeing is that it creates places where school children and families, and others can go to be on their land and to reconnect with the land, because through that larger process of the extermination of the bison and the extermination of Indigenous people that took place, I would say that the forces that attempted to do that were very effective and did distance Native people from the land. And so bringing buffalo back is also bringing back the relationships. And one of my dear friends and colleagues, Monica Rattling-Hawk, talks about ecosystem relationships. She kind of talks about the illusion of managing the land, managing the buffalo, and instead talks about being in relationship with the land, being in relationship with the buffalo. And I think it's a great perspective. And I hope that over time, that kind of term spreads, because to me, it's an illusion that we can manage all these things under all of the varying forces that act, between climate and a number of other things that act on the land. So the next part of the question about the term was used was purebred bison, and I think that it's important to understand that when bison were nearly eradicated, in those herds that were remaining that were saved, there was efforts by some ranchers and others to either create a hardier cow or to create a more docile bison. And so there was forced breeding that happened between those animals. And so a legacy of that, because there were so few animals remaining, is that the majority, if not all, bison alive today have some level of what's called cattle gene introgression, which is just a fancy way of saying that they have some cattle genes, even if it's minute. The Department of Interior's herds, my understanding is that they have less than 2% cattle DNA, and that's kind of the upper threshold. The most that any have is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2% cattle genes, but that it tends to be much more minute than that. And there are a few herds in North America, like the Yellowstone herd and a herd in Canada called the Elk Island herd, that again, my understanding is that they are known to have far less cattle gene introgression. And so some people view those as unique and particularly valuable. I know that amongst Native nations, when they talk about Yellowstone buffalo and securing some Yellowstone buffalo today, that they also value Yellowstone buffalo because they were one of the last, if not the last, wild free roaming herd. And it was pretty touch and go. So around 1886, when I was talking about the survey of all bison that was done by William Temple Hornaday, at the time they found that there was about 200 bison left in the Yellowstone area. By I believe it was 1905, there was only 25 left, and they actually had to implement martial law to protect those last 25 buffalo. As they built up the Yellowstone herd, I believe that some animals were brought in from outside, and so there may have been some small amount of cattle gene introgression that happened there. But generally, what I would say is that it's a very sensitive subject, again, with our Native Nation partners, because on the one hand, I don't think there's really anyone who is actively crossbreeding bison with cattle today. But like I said, there's this legacy of crossbreeding early on in the recovery of bison. But as some people might know, amongst Native nations, there are many people who have some European blood, some blood other than just native blood, and they would never discriminate against their friend, their relative, their brother for having some amount of blood that is not just native blood. And so why would they discriminate against their relative, the buffalo, if it looks like a buffalo, acts like a buffalo, and is, their relative? And so I guess that's how I would answer that question, and just say that, really today there isn't any active efforts to cross buffalo with cows. And to the degree possible, there are scientists and tribes that are thinking about how to manage for the long-term genetic diversity of bison. And one of the key ways of doing that is actually managing large, diverse herds. And so Lakota is one great example, having over 1,000 bison in one place, which is actually a relatively rare thing. That's one of the largest tribal bison herds in the country. And the fact that there are 11 different sources of animals from across DOI and the Nature Conservancy, American Prairie, all in that same herd, really makes it an extremely diverse herd. And I think that that's the goal, is just to try and maintain that diversity, and then allow the environment and natural selection to decide which traits are adaptive going into the future.
That was a fantastic answer. I think that you answered my questions and several people who have chimed in. So thanks for that, Dennis. You also answered my resiliency question about Native nations. So thank you for that. You're getting lots of them in one
Sure.
response. So let's move on to an ecological standpoint. How has the restoration of bison herds impacted, say, the Greater Prairie itself, plants, animals, all of that? Yeah. What are you seeing on the ground?
Okay, well, maybe I could start first with like what we can measure or have measured. And I think that one of the really exciting things that we saw at Wakota, and I'll refer back to Wakota quite a lot because it's one of our more well-studied examples. But just in the short time that bison have been back since 20, 2020, but we began monitoring actually in 2019 before the bison were put back on the land. And that site had cattle herds on it, and before that, wild horses uh, grazing on the site. And I would say that to some degree, the site had been overgrazed prior to bison being restored. So we did a gradual restoration of bison where we started out at restoring them to the 8,000 acres of the overall area, because the first installment from Department of Interior was 100 bison. Then the next year it was we expanded to 12,000 acres, and they received another 600 bison from Department of Interior. And it's been really amazing to see because there has been drought over that period where the bison have gradually been restored back to Lakota. But despite that, with bison back on the land, what the monitoring team has been observing is that there's been increasing plant vigor. So the plants are growing taller. They're actually going to seed, and that's really a legacy of like if you have overgrazing, you are not storing as much energy in the roots of the plant, and so the plants are becoming healthy. They're becoming more vigorous over time, and so you're now getting warm season grasses going to seed, and that means that they can then reproduce and increase across the landscape. And Also, another thing that's really amazing to see is that the number of native plant species detected across Lakota, and recognize that some of these or all of these species were in the seed bank. Maybe some were just undetectable because they had been so overgrazed. But from the time that we started monitoring before bison were restored to last summer, they've gone from detecting 26 native plant species to detecting 52 native plant species. So, it's just a doubling, a remarkable change in the biodiversity of plants. But I guess I would say that maybe on the more theoretical side, that there are certain things that bison do that cattle don't. I think that sometimes people might almost suggest that somehow bison have like some kind of magical abilities, but really it just has to do with that they're a different species, that they have unique behaviors like wallowing. And wallowing is rolling in the dirt and creating depressions and bare soil. And there's been studies by individuals like Jason Baldus, who is Shoshone from the Wind River Reservation, and he found that many of the traditional medicinal plants of his people were found around wallows that have over time regrown. But when you look at wallows, there's so many different ways in which they can impact the landscape. So an individual wallow can hold water, which allows for frogs and toads to lay eggs that can then, in those small pools of water that collect in the wallows, can allow them to hatch, to go through the entire cycle of becoming toads and frogs themselves, and then leaving those places. As I mentioned earlier, you can have birds gathering the hair of buffalo, lining their nests with it. I'm sure the same is probably true of rodents. I think another thing that's really fascinating, and I think I have a picture maybe later in my slides of a yucca plant. And I don't know if any of you have ever been close to a yucca, but if you put your hands near a yucca, they are so razor sharp. The tips will make your hand bleed. But one observation that myself and others have made is that at times when the vegetation on the prairies is dry and there's not a lot of moisture in the late summer and fall when it's really hot. Um, the bison will specifically target yucca. They will find a yucca plant. They will stick their face right down into it, despite them being razor sharp. They will grab it with their teeth. They will pull it out of the ground, and then they will consume the root. And the root is just full of moisture at a time when there is no, moist plants on the surrounding landscape. And so one thing that we've seen is that on a place like Lakota, because there hasn't been a bison for about 140 years, there are places that are just thick with yucca. But since the bison were restored, they're now thinning that yucca and maybe bringing things a bit back into balance, and it creates more space for other native plant species. So, there's just a transformation that happens in these landscapes over time. And again, I wouldn't attribute it to bison being magical creatures, although I love them dearly, but just to their unique behaviors, grazing behaviors, wallowing behaviors, and the way that they use the landscape differently than cattle, which have largely replaced them.
Amazing. It's just when we get out of the way, it's amazing how nature can come back when you put these important keystone species back in and you can see it coming back right before your eyes, or the sharp, painful ones can go away.
Right.
So that is fantastic. So obviously this project isn't stopping here. This is what you do, and we're going to continue doing. So what is the next phase, or the next big initiative, next big milestone that all of you are working towards?
So right now, one of the most exciting things that I've seen happen, and I would say that to some degree, it's an outgrowth of the remarkable people that are within the federal administration right now. So one thing to note, and I'm sure many people are aware of this, is that Secretary Holland is the first Indigenous cabinet member of a president. And if you look from Secretary Holland to the Assistant Secretary's office and to what they call essentially the hallway of the Assistant Secretary, so all of the people that sit in that office, people within U.S. Department of Agriculture who are also Indigenous, there has been such an amazing effort to recognize both the challenges and the opportunities within what's referred to as Indian country, to do better. Because there is representation of Indigenous people within the federal government, they understand the challenges and they recognize many of the ways of moving forward, and they are willing to listen to the communities in a way that maybe hasn't happened previously and not to the same extent. And so about a year and I guess I'd say a year and a half ago, colleagues within the federal administration at Department of Interior and U.S. Department of Agriculture came to World Wildlife Fund, Native Americans at Philanthropy, and some of our partners at Intertribal Buffalo Council and the Nature Conservancy, and they challenged us to do more and to do better. They said, the federal government has a certain role in supporting Indigenous people, but so does philanthropy, so do nonprofits. And so they said, help us to leverage the resources that we can bring to support tribes in doing what they envision for the return of buffalo to tribal lands. And this photo is the Lakota landscape. And, this, although each reservation within the Northern Great Plains is distinct, when you look at these large intact grasslands, the one thing to be aware of, I think, is that to a greater degree, Indigenous people in this region have kept their lands intact. They are still in grassland. There is some farming, but to a far lesser degree than you would have on the surrounding lands that are not within reservations. And, our Indigenous partners talk about the fact that the best stewards of the land are both Indigenous people, but even more so buffalo. And so they want to see buffalo brought back to restore the lands in the ways that I just spoke about with at Lakota. And so we're embarking on this amazing and historic new partnership with Native Americans in Philanthropy, Intertribal Buffalo Council, the Nature Conservancy, and World Wildlife Fund to try and restore bison with tribes on a whole new level. And I guess when I say that, it might be hard to like imagine what that means. But right now, Intertribal Buffalo Council has 85 member tribes across the United States. They've been in existence for about 30 years, and they have something called herd development grants that they deliver to their member tribes to support them in restoring bison. Each year, they receive $1.4 million in federal funding to achieve that. Now, when you actually do the math on 85 member tribes dividing 1.4 million amongst themselves, that amounts to about $15,000 per year per tribe. So it doesn't go very far. And just to, I guess, put that in perspective, and not to take away anything from other indigenous groups and the species that they manage, but the salmon tribes in the United States receive somewhere on the order of about 140 million annually. And of course, salmon were never eradicated or nearly exterminated like bison. And so there isn't the same restoration component required in that space. But I think, what we're all working towards is to support Intertribal Buffalo Council in their mission of supporting member tribes to achieve their visions, to stabilize their programs, to get to a point where they are either self-sustaining or in a position where they can achieve what it is that they want to achieve for their nations. And it's a very ambitious effort. We're all really excited about it, and I think that working for an organization like World Wildlife Fund and looking at what has been achieved globally by World Wildlife Fund when they make a concerted effort around a specific issue in a given place, like doubling tigers, I think that we're going to see some amazing things happen. Because my dream in working at World Wildlife Fund over the past 17 years was really that this work would rise from a programmatic priority of our Northern Great Plains program to an organizational priority, and now we've reached that. And I guess I would say I'm excited to report that Intertribal Buffalo Council, with the support of the Tribal Buffalo Lifeways Collaboration, which is what this larger effort is called, found out just in the past week that Intertribal Buffalo Council secured 3 grants that they applied for in the amount of over $60 million. And so considering that over the past 30 years, they've had about $1.4 million annually to distribute, we're really excited about how working together in towards each of our strengths and playing to each of our strengths is, we hope, going to bring far more resources to these efforts and in the long run support tribes in achieving their vision, which also I think is entirely aligned in supporting our vision of healthy and thriving prairies, wildlife, and people.
Wow, that is an incredible update. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can't believe that we're already at the top of the hour. I feel like we could talk for hours on end. But before I move on to the next question or part or anything like that, how can we best support bison restoration and WWF in this very important work?
Okay, well, as I said, the Tribal Buffalo Lifeways collaboration is very new. So we're still getting the website up, and that means that I can offer the web address, and I guess I would just say keep trying, and ultimately you will see it up and accessible, and that is tribalbuffalo.org. And ultimately there will also be a way that you can support the efforts through donation, and those donations would flow to our tribal partners. Of course, you can look to WWF's Bison work on our website as well. So that's World Wildlife Fund US.org, and find our web information about bison and our bison work. And I guess I would also just add that there is a bill that's making its way through Congress, both the House and the Senate, called the Indian Buffalo Management Act. And I would say that for those who are active in reaching out to their senators and representatives, if you can put in a good word for having your senator or representative continue to support passage of the Indian Buffalo Management Act, that would be huge. So I hope that offers a few ways that you can support us. And also, I think, maybe to the degree that all of you felt like this was useful information that I shared today, once this is up online, if you can share this as well. I think that one thing that I've found is that no matter how many times I tell the story of the loss and the return of buffalo and the vision of Native nations in bringing bison back, that there's still more people who need to hear it, more people who don't know. So share the message far and wide, and let people know that supporting tribes and bringing buffalo back to their lands is important to you, to the world, to the prairies, and can have a real and meaningful impact.
Yes, absolutely. It's amazing when we get the voice out and share the conservation word, what can happen. Again, we've reached time, but I do have one question that I've received multiple times, Dennis, if you're okay
Okay,
answering this one question.
sure.
What is the difference between bison and buffalo? If you could
Okay,
just
yeah, great
explain the
question, and
difference.
I should have addressed that early on, and I appreciate the question. So, I will say that technically buffalo are Asian and African species, but early on in as the West was settled, early explorers referred to bison as buffalo because that's what they were familiar with, and that name has stuck with rural and indigenous peoples in North America. And so our partners in rural America and tribes refer to them as buffalo, whereas I'd say urbanites and scientists tend to refer to them as bison. And I guess you could say more properly they are known as bison. I often use the two interchangeably because I work with Native nations to such a great extent on bison restoration. But as a scientist, I know that sometimes people will say they are truly bison, and that is correct.
Oh, thank you so much for just explaining that for us. I did have lots of questions on that. So
Sure.
yeah, a great one to address. So thank you for that. And Dennis, thank you so much for taking the time to present today. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, as Dennis so awesomely shared, and we will have that in the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Appreciate everyone listening.